Hello, and welcome to Nothing Ever Happens in Canada, but we know this is simply not true. This is a Canadian podcast about the myths, legends, and just good old stories Canada has to tell. I'm Canadian Girl. Thanks for joining me today. If you are new to the channel, hello, and thanks for joining the crew. This channel is actually full of good old adventures from Canada that take you from province to province, and even up to the territories to learn some really great tales. Grab your favorite beverage and take a sip. Sit back and come adventure with me across Canada and find out what's really going on over here. Hit that subscribe button today so you don't miss any of our adventures. And do tell all your friends, family, and even neighbors about us so they can go on some great adventures. Just hit that share button and send those Canadian Girl adventures out there for everyone to enjoy. Now enough with all this business stuff. I have two very interesting ladies I want you to meet. First is Kit Coleman, a journalist, but not just any, a true master of disguise. She would erase 8 years from her life with one stroke of a pen, change her name quite a few times, become the very first female war correspondent, the first female journalist to be in charge of her own section in a Canadian newspaper, and the first syndicated columnist in all of Canada. She was definitely a big deal and someone we should all know today as part of our history. The second, also another master of disguise, working as a school teacher by day and by night, was an investigative journalist who wore any look, from dressing up as a young man to a poor old woman, to get the story she was after. Interviewing those in jail, from Hollywood and the homeless, a teacher running around in the dark of night getting the latest scoop was not what anyone expected, but that's exactly what Alice Freeman did. And she did it very well, all under the alias Faith Fenton, becoming Canada's first female columnist and Canada's first female editor. Join me now as we meet these two amazing women, look at their contributions to journalism, and their fight to be heard in a man's world. Catherine Ferguson was born in Ireland on February 20th, 1856. You will often see her birth date listed as 1864. This is incorrect. Kind of. You see, Catherine is actually Kit Coleman, that I told you about earlier. I also told you she was a master of disguise, which she is when it comes to hiding her name or true identity. We will discuss these missing 8 years in more detail later. For now, like I mentioned before, all you need to know is Catherine, shortly before she started going by Kit, erased them. Catherine was born in Castle Blakeney in West Ireland. She developed a love of books from her dad, it said, very early on in life. Her mother was blind and taught her to love music just as she did. Shortly after returning from school in Belgium, Catherine would marry at age 20 to please her father's wishes to a much older man in his 40s, Thomas Willis. They would have a daughter who sadly passed away at the age of 2 years old, and the marriage was said to be a very unhappy one. Kathleen Blake, her new adopted name she had taken during the marriage, swapping Catherine with a C for Kathleen with a K, and most believe she chose Blake as her surname to honor her birthplace, but no one knows for sure. This was just the beginning of her many name changes. Mr. Willis would pass away just 8 years later into the marriage, leaving Kathleen a very young widow. On June 26, 1884, at just 28 years old, Kathleen Blake Willis would set sail for Canada. The boat would dock at Quebec City, where Kathleen would sign a log stating she was 8 years younger than she actually was by putting her date of birth as 1864. That's the one that is often incorrectly used in the many retellings of her story today. She signed her name, Kathleen Willis, and with one stroke of her pen, those 8 not-so-pleasant years were gone and she could start over again in Canada the way she wanted to. After docking in Quebec and erasing those 8 years, Kathleen hopped on a train and headed for Toronto. She found a job as a secretary where she met her next husband, Edward Watkins. He was Irish like her, a traveling salesman and her boss. They would have 2 children and move to Winnipeg, where she taught music and French. Sadly, things were not going well in the marriage either, with Edward always being gone. She had even heard rumors of him still being married to a woman back in England, and he would bring home very little money after each business trip. The couple would separate after some time. Her daughter stayed with her, and her son would live at his father's house, just 8 miles away. In 1889, Edward would pass away, making Kathleen a widow again. She would move back to Toronto and began cleaning houses to make some extra money to help support the family. She also started writing and sending her work into a local magazine in Toronto, under the name Kathleen Blake Watkins this time. That same year, in 1889, she was hired by the Toronto Mail newspaper. They wanted Kathleen Blake Watkins writing for them. Here again, Kathleen would change her name, this time to her most famous one, Kit. She was now in charge of the column Woman's Kingdom, which came out once a week. This was her first big step into the journalism world. She had just become the first female journalist to be in charge of her own column. She worked 16-hour days preparing stories about politics, women's rights, and anything else they wanted her to cover. She sent her daughter to boarding school as she had no time to take care of her herself, now that she was in charge of her very own column. She used the alias Kit to hide whether she was a man or a woman. Women journalists were sadly not respected back then, so using the alias allowed her to reach more readers who could simply not just dismiss her for being a woman or having a woman's opinion. They did not know who or what Kit was, and of course people bought into that mystery. Women's Kingdom appeared for the first time in October 1889. Kit had become famous. She was a household name, and everyone wanted to read what she had written. She was assigned to some pretty famous stories too, like following Charles Dickens. You know who he is. A Christmas Carol, Oliver's Twist, and Great Expectations, along with Jack the Ripper. We all know who he is. She even stood in the exact spot where... You get the idea. Her father sadly passed away around this time, and she took it rather hard. She always remained close to him. He was the one who first introduced her to her love of books. In 1893, she went to cover the World's Fair in Chicago and interview famous French actress Sarah Bernhardt. The entire fairgrounds was lit up so magically, she couldn't help but feel like she had made it to Cloud 9. It was the first year the fair had used electric lights outside. In 1894, she would cover the Midwinter Fair in San Francisco. It was the first World's Fair to be held there. She played with her alias, Kit of the Mail, which was what she called herself in full, but was more well known as Kit for short. She claimed to be a descendant from an Irish king and that she lived with a very good friend named Theodosia, who played into her royal connection. All of it was not true at all. Kit was described by so many as being funny, full of wit, and was not afraid to step out of line to say what needed to be said. A good example often given is that she was asked to cover fashion stories more than she wanted to, being a woman journalist. It was pretty much expected of her to report on fashion, so she did, but in her own way. A quote from one of her stories, "The new hats are weird, but we say that every spring and still wear them." She loved to write about what she heard on the streetcars as she rode them each day to work. She knew what her readers were talking about, so she wrote about it. She called her readers affectionately paper people and referred to their pets as jungle people. She loved to make up her own terms, and most importantly, she liked personally connecting with her readers. She would make jokes about the latest women's fashion in her other writing when she could. Examples that often stand out are that dresses were becoming so puffy they could only fit through saloon doors, or that ladies' bonnets were getting so tall you could hardly see over them at the theater. Because of these comments, many believed Kit to be a man. In 1895, her beloved paper, the Toronto Mail, who always let her speak so freely, merged with the Empire, a more conservative paper, leaving Kit to have to bite her tongue and speak more like a lady in the Woman's Kingdom weekly column. And with that, Kit's readers went crazy, sending letter after letter, and I mean real letters here, no fancy computer stuff, paid postage and everything, demanding that the old Kit return to writing their beloved column. Her readers did not like the change and made it known. The Prime Minister at the time, Wilfrid Laurier, was a huge fan of Kit's writing, and she knew that. She used that to her advantage from time to time, writing to him to ask for his advice or help on a matter. This time, she really needed her friend's help to cover the Queen's Royal Jubilee. In 1897, she got just that, a chance to cover Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. It would become her best-selling book, To London for the Jubilee. In 1898, she would take her next big step into journalism. This time, it was a huge step, and a step that was risking her life. She became the first accredited female war correspondent. In July of that year, after many delays by those who did not want a female journalist reporting on the war, she was even marooned on a boat which could not dock due to the soldiers all having yellow fever. During this time, Kit acted as a nurse until she managed to get on board of a freighter leaving the Key West, Florida area. She finally made it to Cuba. Getting home was no easy feat either. She was delayed in many ways again. But she did in fact make it home. This experience changed her life and career forever, instantly. Her accounts of the war and the amount of human casualties that is often not mentioned were the height of Kit's career. She was absolutely famous now. Everyone knew who Kit of the Mail was. The horrors of the war had left her with post-traumatic stress, it is suspected, as it was never diagnosed back then. That same year, after returning home, she would meet her final husband and true love, Theobald Coleman, who was born in Ontario. He respected her career, and she admired that about him. She was very adamant a woman should make her own money and never have to rely on a man. She believed a woman should always have her own independence, a quality in her I admire and strive for myself. Theobald was a doctor and recently accepted a position in Copper Cliff, Ontario in 1901, near Sudbury. He was employed by the Canadian Copper Company that was mining in the area. While here, Kit learned to ride horses and began breeding and training show dogs that were a type of terrier. She made the best of her time in the mining community, still sending out the odd story when she could, but finding it hard to still stay connected to the city life. The area of Copper Cliff was not what Kit was used to. There were no trees, no grass, or plant life. There was just very dark brown dirt everywhere for miles. In February 1901, smallpox broke out across the mining camp, and Kit, of course, wrote about it. The mining community was not a fan of the famous writer living amongst them, and decided they no longer needed Dr. Coleman's services, and the couple left in 1904, when they moved to Hamilton, Ontario. To see pictures of Kit, the mining town, and more, head over to nothingcanada.com and check out the show notes section. There's even a great YouTube documentary that can be found by Historica Canada, or of course, the links are always in the show notes below. Kit was a changed woman and cared more about politics and women's rights than fashion and cooking, and tried to write about them whenever she could. She even managed to get a world-exclusive interview with Canadian-born legendary fraudster Cassie Gadwick, who defrauded banks out of millions of dollars. I promise we will do an episode about her one day. She is quite the character. But how did Kit get that interview? She pretended to forget her lovely pair of ladies' gloves back at the cell, where all the other reporters had just been whisked away from. Cassie and Kit quickly struck up a conversation, and the story made headlines around the world, and Kit became even more famous. She was then sent to cover even more crime stories after this, but despite her ever-growing fame, she was never really included by the paper as one of its employees, simply because she was not one of the guys. She was never even invited to the annual dinner, year after year, all she had done for them. In 1906, she started her own women's press club, with her other female journalist friends. It was a place that they, the women in journalism, could discuss and support each other in the field. In 1911, she spoke up loud about wanting equal pay, as it was not fair a man was being paid more for simply just being a man. Sounds familiar, right? Sadly, the paper would not agree with her, and she left. After 21 years, she went out on her own. She became the first syndicated column in all of Canada. She made more money than she ever did at her old newspaper job, and when they asked to publish her new column, she refused. Kit of the Mail was now in charge of her own destiny, a dream she had since she was a little girl, and it only took a few name changes, 8 years to just disappear, and a lot of hard work disguising who Kit of the Mail really was. In 1914, life began to take a turn for the worse. Her son contracted TB, and the war had begun. Kit had been writing for 25 years now. Not long after this, she became sick as well and passed away on May 16, 1915. She rests peacefully today in Mount Pleasant, Ontario, under a beautiful Celtic cross. Our next woman in writing and master of disguise is Alice Matilda Freeman. Born in Bowmanville, Ontario in 1857, she was the third of 12 children. Her parents moved to Barrie, Ontario shortly after she was born. Alice's mother noticed she was a very bright girl right away, and knowing the family living on a farm and had no means to educate the young girl, made a choice to send her 10-year-old daughter to live with a minister and his wife back in Bowmanville, Ontario, who had no children of their own. The move was a good choice for Alice. She was very well taken care of in the home, and did receive a proper education over the 4 years she spent with the adopted family. She continued to study, and at 18 years old became a school teacher for the Toronto School Board, a position she held for almost 20 years. And of course, as you know, she would get into journalism as well, thanks to all her education. Alice needed both her teaching salary, which was only a measly $300 a year at the time, half of what the male teachers were making, and her writing earnings, which were $2 apiece, to support herself, being a single woman and being paid so much less than the males around her in the same field. And in order to keep both jobs, she'd have to be 2 different people. She began writing as a Toronto correspondent for the Northern Advance, a daily newspaper from Barrie, Ontario in 1886. She was a Canadian school teacher by day and an investigative journalist by night. Back then, being a wholesome school teacher meant there was no way one could be a shady, crooked journalist, as they were seen back then, all at the same time. But Miss Freeman, she did, and she did it by using many disguises and an alias known as Faith Fenton. In 1888, Faith began writing a column called Women's Empire. It dealt with women's issues that were relevant at the time: sexual discrimination, harassment, child abuse, and the old male versus female wage war. Pretty sad, right? 132 years ago, Faith started writing about this stuff in a public newspaper column for all to read, and it's still one of the biggest arguments today with the whole Me Too movement that's out there now. We almost got this, girls. Keep trying. I'm so proud of you all for speaking up. But back to Faith and her column, Women's Empire, which made Faith Canada's first female columnist. She would write at night and only travel to get stories during the summer months to keep her cover. She interviewed many famous people during these summer trips. Alice was a teacher, interviewing people in jail, homeless shelters, and mixing with actors to get the latest Hollywood gossip. She was known to dress in so many disguises, anything from a young Hollywood actor in slick pants and sunglasses to a very poor old woman with gray hair hobbling along with a cane. She would do anything to get the best story, all under the cover of a great disguise, and then turn around and walk away into the dead of night down the dark city streets alone to go and write about it all under her alias, Faith, leaving her students and the parents completely in the dark about her double life. She was able to keep her identity a secret until 1893, 7 years. In 1894, after being exposed as a journalist, she resigned from her teaching position to pursue journalism full-time. In 1895, she became the first female editor for Canada Home Journal. Then, the gold was discovered in the Yukon, and off Alice went to cover the action. She would travel with the Yukon Field Force, which contained 200 soldiers and 4 Victorian Order of Nurses, and herself as a correspondent for the Globe paper. The group would leave Toronto in the spring, traveling across very rough terrain, and arrive in the Yukon in August, so you could say it was quite the hike. And at some point along the way, just before arriving in Dawson City, Alice changed into her walking skirt, something men had not seen up there before, which meant her ankles were showing, and this caused a bit of a disturbance. So she was forced to sew an extra piece of cloth on her skirt hem to hide her ankles, avoiding any more problems. Can you imagine not being able to show your ankles after walking that far? Once Alice arrived in Dawson City, she quickly sent her writings back to Toronto, describing everything she had seen, from wildlife to very strange people. She described the human chain of over 5,000 men climbing over the mountain that is a famous picture often found if you Google the gold rush in the Yukon. She describes fights she had seen along the way, the gold she had seen, of course, and so much more. The hardest part was always getting the stories back in time and while they were still relevant. The mail system from the Yukon to Toronto at the time was very, very, very slow. But her stories were always worth the wait and often became front-page news. Alice even covered Dawson City's Great Fire of December 1898, where most of the city burnt to the ground. She even once sent out a story about a man that was being on a Monday, trying to beat the slow mailing system, and when the was postponed by famous Colonel Sam Steele himself, she sent an RCMP officer who was a friend to retrieve the story. While in Dawson City, she would meet Dr. John Brown, who was from Toronto. He was completing his service as the Yukon medical officer at the time. The pair hit it off and were married not long after on New Year's Day, January 1st, 1900, in a log church. The story goes, they couldn't think of a better way to start the century than with a wedding. And I happen to think that's pretty damn romantic. The couple would move back to Toronto in 1904. Alice would go on to live a happy and full life, passing away just 4 days before her 79th birthday in 1936. You can see pictures of Alice and her adventures in the Yukon at Nothing Canada under the show notes section, or of course the links are always in the notes below. Kit Coleman and Alice Freeman are just 2 of Canada's amazing women in writing. There are so many more out there, and even more out there today thanks to them. Journalism, or writing let's call it, is now everywhere thanks to computers and the invention of the internet. You can now write whatever you want, wherever you want, whenever you want. And you just never know who's reading it, because nowadays, it could be anybody. Thanks to all our modern day technologies, we now have access to 1 billion articles. All we have to do is type in what we're looking for and press send. After that, the rabbit hole you choose is up to you. Back when our girls, Kit and Alice, were just fighting to be heard, writing was not so easy. You had to stand out from the crowd just to get published. Otherwise, your writing would not be seen by anyone. Kit and Alice stood loudly together fighting for women's rights and to be heard in a man's world. Between the 2 of them, they invented what it meant to write a woman's column in the newspaper back then. Women wanted more than just the latest new scarf update and what the next big pie everybody was baking. They wanted to know what was going on in the real world, and they wanted to talk about it. Kit and Alice were their voices, and they spoke loudly, so loudly that they are still heard today. So next time you hit that send button on a post that you are so proud of to have written, remember the women in writing like Kit Coleman and Alice Freeman, also known as Faith Fenton, who fought so hard to have our voices finally heard so freely. I'm Canadian Girl, Until next time, my friends. Want to help support the show? You can do that in 3 simple ways. The first one, you can leave us a shiny 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. This small gesture means so much to this podcast as it allows us to move around on the podcast charts and meet more awesome listeners like you. The second, you can stop by our souvenir shop and pick up a souvenir from one of our great adventures and take it on your very own. There's t-shirts, water bottles, notebooks, and so much more. Do head over to our souvenir shop today and grab some adventure gear. And finally, the third way you can help support the show is by donation. We have a fancy PayPal button that can be found on the top right of our webpage. This button allows you the option to donate as much as you want, whenever you want. All donations will be used for the channel by buying new books for research and upgrading equipment. All 3 links to help support the show, of course, can be found in the show notes below. I thank you all so much for your support of the show. It means the world to me.